This is Peggy from RAW. So our guest today is Kristy Duncan. Kristy is the founder and CEO of Women in Payments. So Women in Payments is a global organization supporting women across the payment ecosystem. The organization has a special place in my heart because it was with Women in Payments that I spoke to my first panel, and Kristy doesn't even know that. So it's very cool to have her with us today. And tell us more about the organization, and thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Peggy. I'm delighted to be here. Always happy to chat with you, and I love what you're doing with Roar Ventures. Women in Payments, gosh, I started this on the side of my desk in 2012. I have an engineering background. I'm a payments geek, and I've been working in the payments market for a long time. And what we have done is create a platform for women around the world to speak, to have mentoring opportunities, to have recognition. We've got award programs in each of our countries. We've got Fintech pitch contest, my unicorn challenge that we're running in all countries now. So it's really an opportunity for career development for women around the world.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for your advocacy. It's been a great, to your point, a great organization to recognize women as well. So let's discuss the new normal in financial services. So from your perspective, and that's the first question, what do you think will be some of the major lasting impacts of COVID in the finance industry?
Great question, Peggy, and I'm not even sure that we can see the end of this pandemic yet. So the new normal is still, I think, evolving. What we have seen in the first 6 months or so is a huge evolution to doing everything digital. So on the B2B side and the consumer side, we're seeing a lot more e-commerce, a lot of B2B electronically. We're hopefully going to see the end of cheques sooner rather than later, and especially on the B2B side, because in the past there haven't been a lot of opportunities to migrate cheques to different payment options because they weren't as viable, certainly in the Canadian market, and that's perhaps different in some of the more advanced markets. But I'm hoping we'll ultimately see the end of cheques, and it's questionable, I think, whether we'll see the end of cash. So looking at the kind of the paper-based payment options, we've got cheques, hopefully they're on the way out. Cash, I think, is a little different because while some people are shying away from cash, certainly with fears that perhaps the paper money will transmit the virus, others on the kind of fringes of society, the underserved financially, may not have access to some of those other payment options. So like the credit and debit cards or other e-commerce payment methods. So I think there is still a place for cash, although I think ultimately it will be diminished. So what we're seeing is a migration from the cash to electronic payment options. So lots of tap, and in Canada we're good at that, and we're quite comfortable with it. I think the US market is getting more comfortable with it. It's a good opportunity for them to get up to contactless payments. And another thing that we're seeing is a migration or a big embrace of, I'm going to call it silver tech, which is the population over the age of 50 or 60, who some banks have seen 30% increase in adoption in that particular demographic for both mobile banking and online banking and online payments. So the older people are recognizing now, oh, maybe there is a good reason for me to get online and do payments electronically, whereas they didn't necessarily have that motivation before. The other thing I think that we're going to see, and this is kind of regardless of COVID, but what was happening already was a migration from some of the central banks to the central bank digital currency. And there's been a huge push on that. Certainly it's motivated by Libra and Facebook's foray into digital currencies. But I think the central banks are becoming more interested in that. Again, kind of regardless outside the COVID question, but mostly motivated by emerging competition in that area, that the central banks don't want to lose the control of their currencies, which is a huge opportunity for them to manage their monetary policies.
Exactly. And I mean, that's a great transition to the next question, which is linked with financial stability and global order. So where do you see that coming? And you talk about controlling your money, which is obviously very important when you have so much sovereign debt as we have right now. Do you see anything regarding global financial stability that you would like to share?
Oh, global financial stability. It's not something I generally talk about, but yeah, the landscape is changing, and certainly with all of the COVID relief that has been pushed into the market with great speed and by a lot of the different governments around the world. Uh, there's been a lot of money printed per se um, in the last little while, and it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. I think for not only in the short and medium term, but even the longer term, it's going to be a huge um, amount for us to pay back, and it probably won't be you and me as much as our kids or our grandkids. And that stability question, I think, is going to perhaps come and haunt us because there is an opportunity to perhaps redraw the lines of where the economic power lies amongst the global geo superpowers.
And back to your points, coming back to payments, controlling your currency is obviously one of the weapons that government have, and they cannot really let go of that. Talking about government and weapon, and changing gear to regulations and policies, do you see anything on this end happening following COVID in terms of new perspective from regulators and governments in terms of policies and regs?
That's a great question because I think certainly COVID has driven a lot of government payments. When we look at governments trying to get relief payments out to businesses, out to consumers and citizens, that they have really embraced all payments digital to be able to make those payments quickly and easily and securely. And when we're looking at um, governments going forward, I think the governments that have already had policies and regulators who had policies in place that supported those electronic payment means were, ahead. And the other governments who were perhaps lagging there have opportunities now to really kind of open up not the market, not only for electronic government payments, but for all electronic and e-commerce payments. So we're seeing a lot of the payments organizations, networks, etc., have a special focus just on governments because they are a huge driver of the payments market. I used to do work for the Receiver General in Canada, and what I found, perhaps not to my surprise, was they are one single player that actually has the power to move the market. So it's nice now that we have this COVID-19 motivation to start moving more of those government payments to online and electronic options.
That's a very good point. I have to admit, I never thought about that actually, but it's actually definitely moving the needle coming from that perspective on the payment side. I never really thought of that. Thank you. Um, in terms of resetting competitive positioning, so what type of financial organization do you think will benefit from the crisis?
Oh boy, I hate playing God and calling winners and losers, but it's I would say there's lots of opportunity in the market. Certainly, the innovators who are nimble and able to react quickly and to seize some of these opportunities. So I think that clearly points to the fintechs in the markets. But especially the fintechs who are operating in markets that have supportive regulatory environments. So, certainly in the first world, the UK is leading there, Singapore, Australia. Some of the other countries are in a bit of catch-up mode, but the nice thing is now we've got this great opportunity to catch up and hopefully even leapfrog, because moving to digital will only help our economies become stronger, not only for the short and medium term, but in the longer term, so that we don't need that paper to make our economies continue to operate.
And in terms of large financial institutions, what do you see in terms of transformation? And you're absolutely right, depending on the countries, they're all in different, even if you're looking at developed countries, they're all in a bit of a different situation. So maybe I'll focus on North America. And if you have perspective on other geography, that would be lovely as well.
In terms of large financial institutions, that's a really good question. I think where we are now with the big banks is the big banks are a critical part of our payments infrastructure. We can't run the payment system without the banks because all the payments currently go through the banks. What we are finding is that the customer relationship, the service that is provided to customers in some cases can actually be provided in more innovative ways and more nimble ways by third parties, by the fintechs. And there's a migration in some markets to some degrees for the big banks to collaborate with these fintechs to create the best of both worlds. So the strong, powerful, secure, reliable payment system, and then layer on top the cool, exciting, user-friendly customer experience that's offered by the fintechs. And together, those two can be very powerful and benefit both sides. So the banks as well as the fintechs, so that the customer, ultimately, be it a business customer or a consumer, gets a great experience with the underlying security and reliability of that great payment facility. So I don't know if that answers your question, but generally, I think that's where the market is starting to go. And some countries are more advanced than others. And some banks are perhaps more advanced than others. I think the days are gone of the bank being, one single bank being all things to all people, because there's so much more competition in the market, and the innovations just can't be ignored because, like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but if I have, vanilla ice cream and I could get rainbow sherbet or candy floss or moose tracks across the street, there's only so long that I really want to just live with vanilla.
Exactly. And new generations that have been used to that wide range of choices, they are not going to go with that. So you have challenge with retention, and you cannot attract on top of that. So I absolutely see that. So staying on the topic of transformation, but maybe a bit lighter. So what have you done? What have you learned in the last 6 months on a more maybe personal base that transform you in a new person post-COVID, post-pandemic, or at least post-lockdown?
Oh, great question. I think everybody's learned a lot in the last 6 months. We've learned a lot about pandemics and how we react to them, and the kind of the human as a social being. And that's one of the things, I keep hearing people saying, oh, well, we're just going to get rid of these office towers. We don't need offices anymore because everybody can work from home. And I think what we'll see ultimately is a hybrid. And so when we come out of this lockdown or this pandemic, and it's going to go in waves that we're already seeing, I think the world is going to be different. And what have I learned? I've learned that we can do lots digitally. things that we didn't even want to or think about doing digitally before. Certainly Women in Payments is doing digital conferences now, and we've done a big pivot to do that. And we've also tried to add value to the market in different ways. So with new content and new approaches to networking opportunities and services for our members to really help build on our mandate, which is connect, inspire, champion women across the global ecosystem. So we're trying to add new opportunities for women to help them build careers. And I think you can see that across a whole bunch of different industries, is that they're reinventing themselves. And it doesn't have to be, you know, a meal in a restaurant. It could be a meal, a restaurant meal that's delivered, or a restaurant meal that is served in the privacy of your own home or your garden or out on a patio. So there's been lots of innovation, and I'm so delighted to see it, and things that we never would have thought about before all of a sudden are popping up. People are getting really creative, and that's really inspiring to see.
And intellectually, you know, I think for each of us, it's also to question our own modus operandi and, well, why? I've always done that way. Well, maybe now I can finally do something. It's a very good example of a conference. You know, we were talking offline and we were talking about the international aspect of it. It would have been very difficult before to do that. You had multiple conferences in different geographies. Now you're going to be able to have speakers from all over the world and attendees from all over the world. I mean, that's a massive upside in terms of sharing knowledge, but also networking. But
oh, fantastic. Yeah. And to your point, I just recorded a keynote for the Women in Fintech conference in Uganda this week. And then I'll be speaking next month at the Istanbul Fintech Week. So, you know, awesome. I couldn't have done that back to back in a face-to-face world. You know, I'd be living on airplanes, but this way it's nice. And you're right, it's not the same, but it's pretty good. And one day we'll get back to normal and we'll probably do a little bit of both.
But exactly, I think to your point, it's going to be hybrid for everything. Well, thank you so much, Kristy, for taking the time to chat with us and sharing your insights on payments. It's always very, very valuable, and looking forward to the conference. And thank you again for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Peggy. It's been great chatting with you. And yeah, looking forward to the conference just next week. It'll be awesome.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.